So welcome to the next talk about FreeSewing by Joost. And yeah, have fun.
All right, thank you for coming to my little talk here at FOSDEM. Before I start, I just want to say it's really cool to be here today. I came to FOSDEM the first time, I think it was 2003. It was amazing. It was also absolutely overwhelming. I was afraid to talk to anybody. And all of these people seemed like, I don't know, like it would be cool to be like them, but like I just didn't think that was something that I had in me. Yet here I am today. And the road I took to get here was, I think, an unusual one. Because I'm here to talk about FreeSewing, which is an open source software that I created and maintain. And yeah, sewing. So for those of you who are in the room, because the room they actually wanted to get into had one of those dreaded, the room is full signs. I appreciate that this might be a shock. It's a bit of a niche topic. But don't panic. I'm going to do my best to make it interesting. Okay, so I got into sewing by accident, really. It was the end of 2010, and I got sick with mononucleosis, also known as mono, also known as glandular fever, also known as the kissing disease. And it's anecdotal evidence, but I was not in a relationship at the time, so I can vouch that that label is accurate. The hallmark feature of mono is extreme fatigue. And I can tell you, I was so tired and exhausted, it was incredible. I was too tired even to eat. I mean, I was so skinny. I don't recommend it, but it really, mono gives Ozempic a run for its money when it comes to weight loss. This was the end of 2010, and so by the end of my sick leave, because I couldn't work, it was coming up to the Christmas holidays, and between Christmas and New Year, I had time off from work, from my job anyway. And so I found myself in these weird days between Christmas and New Year, feeling a little bit better, still not great, but like so bored. I was like bored out of my mind. I'd been stuck in bed for a couple of weeks, and I was like, I need to do something. And I had a sewing machine that I had bought at one point because I felt it was like something you should have in your house to do repairs and stuff. But it had mostly been gathering dust. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to make some clothes. I'm going to make something. So I ventured out to my local haberdashery. And I should point out that back then I had no idea what a haberdashery was, because it's one of those weird words that I learned through sewing. But it's basically a shop where you can buy sewing supplies and knitting needles and things for textile crafts. I actually went to this one. This is from Google Street View. It's the Veritas in Rue Neuve, here in Brussels, very close to Place Roger, which is where I lived back then. So I went in there, I bought some fabric, some thread and little bits and pieces that you need to get started. And I also bought a sewing pattern. Now, I don't really know that it was exactly this sewing pattern, but it might have well been. This is sort of like the cover, the envelope. The sewing pattern is actually inside of it. And so what I did in those final days of 2010 is I sat behind the sewing machine and I tried to follow the instructions and the pattern and tried to make these trousers, because I was like, it would be nice to have some trousers to go to work, right? And then lo and behold, in 2011, at the start of the year when the holidays were over, I went to work and I was wearing these new trousers, And I wore them with the sort of like confidence of like, yeah, I made this thing, ain't that great? And then also the ignorance of like not realizing how terrible they actually were, because, my first pair of trousers was not great. These I made 2 years later. I don't have pictures of the first pair, I'm sorry. I think you can still see that they were handmade, but, they're acceptable. And I think I can do better today, but, these were sort of like, okay. So it was the start of the year, it was January, and I was really like hyped about this, like not just that I had been sick, but then also to come out of it with something that I made with my own hands that I could wear. It was really like a great feeling. So I was like, okay, that's it now. Okay, from here on forward, I will make all of my own clothes. I will not buy anything. I will just make everything. I'm going to be that guy. Well, there's some issues with this, to be honest. For starters, I quickly figured out that socks were not something I was going to make, because I don't knit. And so, I was like, okay, socks are okay. For the longest time, I only bought socks. Of course, I still wore the clothes that I already had, but then as those started wearing out, I started realizing, there's other things that are not that obvious for me to make. So, that being said, until today, I still don't buy any clothes that I can make myself. And of course, I made everything I'm wearing today because, I felt this was important. Not the hat, though. Not the hat. Okay, so I would refer to this as the honeymoon period. I was really on a high of having that initial success because, I was willing to fail. I just did it out of boredom, but it worked out, and I was like, oh, this is great. And so I immediately pictured myself as this is going to be a life-changing event, and I sort of imagined in my head that I'd be something like this guy, right? Just like this super suave, everything. This has not happened, right? Because sewing does not really change who you are. I've learned a lot through it, and there's definitely things that have changed, but I'm still the same person, right? Some things that do change is that I'm a lot more conscious about the clothes that I'm wearing, and the clothes, how they fit, how they are made, stuff like that. I also pay a lot more attention to what other people are wearing, and so on and so forth. And if you're like, oh, but yeah, I also pay attention to what other people are wearing, because I saw such and such wear this and that on TikTok, and then I ran out to Temu to buy a knockoff version of that. That's not really what this is about. So I think I need to explain this a little bit with this triangle. So at the top of this sort of triangular spectrum of people who might be drawn to sewing as a hobby, or the people who care about craft, right? And I put that at the top because that's where I reside, so I wanted to project this era of, this is the best way, but that's not true. And then on the right-hand side, you have the people who care about style, right? So the people at the top, they care about how are things made, they care about the fibers and, the threads and stuff like that, and techniques, right? And then the people who are here are predominantly interested in does it look great, And they might be interested in historical styles, and they know all of these rules about you should combine a double-breasted suit jacket with that length of winter coat and stuff like that. I got a lot of respect for those people, but try as I might, it's just not me, right? And then on the left side, are the people that maybe traditionally you would think are the most likely to get into sewing. People who read fashion magazines and are all into that stuff. But in my experience, those are not the people who actually sew or actually end up enjoying it. Because if you're chasing hype, you're going to have less of a good time than if you're interested in making something with your hands or chasing a particular style. And this does not have to look like that. These are also people who are gods or in other sort of niche things are typically more drawn to sewing. All right. Sewing pitch over. That was it. So as I mentioned, FreeSewing is software to generate parametric sewing patterns, or I hope I mentioned that, and if not, then I did so now. So it begs the question, what is a sewing pattern, And I can show you one. This is a sewing pattern. As a matter of fact, it's one generated by FreeSewing. It's our Simon pattern, which is our most popular one. It's a pattern for a button-down shirt. But a sewing pattern really is just a blueprint to make a garment, right? So all of the parts that you need to make a shirt are laid out, and then typically it comes with some instructions on how to put those together, but then experienced people wouldn't even need those instructions. This is also a sewing pattern. This is a commercial sewing pattern. It's not from FreeSewing. It's one of those that comes with a sewing magazine, which is a popular way that people traditionally used to get their sewing patterns. Now, they try to save on paper here, so there's a lot going on, right? You can't really use this as is. People would typically trace that on paper. But basically, the different colors are different parts of the pattern, the sleeve, the front, the back, and then so forth. But then also, every part is there in different sizes, right? which is a problem that we also have with clothes in the store. I think that pretty much everybody here will know the frustration of going to the store, trying to buy some clothes, and then, wait, these don't fit. What's going on? These legs are too short, or these arms are too long, and that sort of stuff. Like, maybe after a while you figure out, oh, that brand kind of works for me, you know? Or like you're unlucky and basically nothing works for you. And we have the same problem with these store-bought and commercial sewing patterns, is that they're not made for you. They are just made for a set of standard sizes. But these quote-unquote standard sizes are just a lie, because there is no such thing. This is just how the industry wants to commoditize the traditional craft of garment making, which was always made for a specific person, right? Now we have standard sizes, and so we have all of these problems, and sewing patterns that come in sizes have exactly the same problems. Historically, though, as I said, clothes were made for somebody, made to measure, so to speak, or bespoke, as we sometimes call that. And there's actually two jobs that come into place. There's the tailor and there's the cutter. And the reason that I bring this up is that with a garment, if it's not in your own size, you can, maybe roll up the sleeves or something. And with a sewing pattern, you can also make changes to the sewing pattern and make adaptations. But it's a little bit like patching a binary, It's possible if you're knowledgeable about the subject and you know what you're doing, but it's going to be a lot easier if you have the source code of the sewing pattern, right? So what is the source code of the sewing pattern? Well, traditionally, the tailor is the person who actually makes the garment. These are the people who are experts with needle and thread, sewing machine, and so on and so forth. And the cutter is the person who actually does the blueprint, comes up with the pattern, and then actually cuts it out of the fabric. Because historically, the cost of the fabric was like the biggest cost factor in manufacturing garments. So these people did not just sort of like come up with a blueprint and then abdicate the responsibility. No, they cut into the fabric, owning their decision of this is going to be it. And then once they had all of that ready, all of those pieces, they handed it over to the tailor. Incidentally, this is the origin of the phrase, having your work cut out for you. Okay, so this is like, as a species, we've been making like garments for eons, right? And this is also a very old craft. This is an edition of the tailor and cutter. I picked this one because it's from the 1st of February, so to the day, this is 158 years old. You might think from the very fancy, the tailor font, that is the thing, but actually the cutter is traditionally seen as the more high-level sort of craft. It's like the most masterful craft is to actually cut out the garment, and then assembling it and making it is also very impressive, and there's also master tailors, but still cutter is sort of like up there because it is like, the most difficult skill. And so when we think about what is the source code of a sewing pattern, it really is what's going on inside the head of the cutter, all of this experience, all of this know-how. Why do you put that line there, What we're trying to do with a sewing pattern is distill this sort of relevant experience and know-how of a cutter into a blueprint so that you can just play the tailor role, right? Now you just have to make the thing. So we, of course, would not know what is going on in those people's heads if it were not that they wrote books about it, right? This is a 200-year-old book. So once again, this is a very old craft that we're dealing with. This is about the art of cutting garments. You can find these books online. They're so old that they're in the public domain. There's like this arcane language, right? Faded text, hand-drawn illustrations, like it's all sort of quite mysterious. But you can also just buy a modern book in full color, which is probably a bit easier to decipher. And if you open one of these books, I have this one, you will find instructions like this one, Draw a vertical line, mark the top as point A, from point A, square out to the right, measuring 1/4 of the circumference of the chest, add 2 inches, mark this point as point B. Very typical drawing instructions. It's basically, okay, this is what the cutter would do, right? And so I bought that pattern and then tried to make a few other things, but I quickly got frustrated in those early months of 2011, doing my new hobby. I got frustrated with this sizing issue, right? And so I learned more and more about sewing, and I discovered, wait a minute, I can just buy one of these books, and then I can plug in my own measurements, and then, in principle, should be perfect, right? So that's what I did. I started out with pen and paper. But I'm one of these people who has trouble reading their own handwriting, you know? So this was quite frustrating. Like, I just didn't really... And at a certain moment, I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this, right? What if I do this on a computer? And that really was the start of my journey that led me to come here. Because if that hadn't happened, I don't think I would be here today. So I'm going to quickly go over the timeline just to show, you know, how much time it took me to get here. Because when I started out, I didn't really know what I was doing. So, as I said, I started sewing at the end of 2010. First couple of months I was using patterns. Then I was like, I got to do this on the computer. And like, you know, once you're on the computer, you start, you know, making abstractions and then stuff like that. And at a certain moment I was like, this is starting to become a little bit useful for me. I'm scratching my own itch here. And, you know, as I mentioned, I came to FOSDEM more than 20 years ago. I really like this ethos of free software and all that stuff. So I was like, I'm going to create a little website so that other people can benefit from this too, right? So in February 2012, I registered the domain, and then in September, I opened it up. It was not false back then, but that was just because I was completely embarrassed about the code that I wrote, right? I was like, I'm not sharing this. This is just terrible. Okay, fast forward a bit. This is the most old data that we have in FreeSewing's production database today. So the oldest accounts are from back there in January 2014, just for myself, and some test accounts. And then, you know, a bit later, towards the start of 2015, it was like early access. You had some early adopters. And then towards the summer of 2017, I launched FreeSewing.org. So now it was open source. I had released the sort of core library earlier in March, but then I still had to build the UI and stuff like that. So that took some time. And to show that, you know, I was still really learning a lot about what it takes to develop, you know, software and stuff like that, I think this graph will tell a great story, because we have no data about all those users, because there was a bug and their registration date was not correctly saved in the database. And, well, that's just how it is. We don't have that data now. But then when we released FreeSewing 3.0, I finally fixed that bug. This also shows that I really don't keep track of these things. And so all those users are then registered on that date, right? So the scale of the graph now makes it seem like there's nothing going on there, but like, yeah. So at this point, we registered about 50,000 people, but those are just all the people that had signed up there. And it had already gotten way bigger than I ever imagined, because, I mean, it is a niche topic, you know? Like the previous 2 presentations ago was like, yeah, billions of people are your potential users. Like that's not true for sewing, right? So 50,000 people signed up, and then people were signing up at a clip of about, I don't know, like between 3,000 and 7,000 users a month. So at the end, this summer, last summer, we are at like 148,000 and something users. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a lot. I don't know. And then TikTok found us. And so, yeah, we had some rough months. And now we're at 364,000 something users. And yeah, you know, it shows that first peak was a bug, because it's just like 1 month and then back to normal. But like here you see it's more organic, you know, because we're shooting up and then we're shooting higher, and then it sort of like tapers off. So, yeah, look, are those big numbers? You tell me, like everything is relative in life, but what I do know is that this is just not something that I imagined when I started out. But what I take more value in, take more stock in, is this graph, because in 2015, started accepting donations. And the reason I did that was that people were asking me, how can we donate? And I was like, you want to what? And they're like, yeah, you know, we like this and we want to support you. And I was like, okay, didn't really think about that. And so I gave it some thought, and I was like, I don't really want to do this for a living. I already have a job, and this risks becoming then the second job, and I don't want that. But after giving it some thought, I was like, you know what? We are pretty privileged to be able to do this for fun, basically. A lot of people are not that privileged. A lot of people are in shitty situations. So yeah, give me your money, and then I will just give it to charity. So that's what we've been doing ever since. And so until this point, we've given more than 70,000 euro to Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. And this is really, for me, the thing. I mean, thank you, but it's other people's money, you know that, right? But now, jokes aside, I'm really happy about this because, you know, this is all fun and writing software and I learned a lot and stuff like that, but we also have to be, you know, aware of the fact that it's a privileged position to be in. A lot of people are in dire straits and this is nice. This is a nice thing to do. All right, so I'm having a hard time when I talk to people who come from a sewing perspective to explain free sewing because of all the open source stuff, and I think vice versa. Here there might be people who are like, I can't even imagine what this is, so I'm going to do like a 30-second live demo. Let's hope I don't mess this up, just to sort of show what it is that we offer. Why does 300 and so many people... Wait, no, this doesn't show up. Trying to drag it to the other screen. Oh, there we go. I'm not great at this. Okay, so where are we? So this is the sewing pattern. This is a simple one because it's about the principle. And then on the bunch on the right here, so this already has my measurements loaded, and it's parametric. So if you load different measurements, I'm not going to go into all of that because I just have to show you, like, you know, if we do this and then we say, like, okay, I want that a little bit more like this, or more like that, you know, then you can just change that, and or I want this more like that. So that's basically what we do and what we offer. And what drives those people to free sewing. Where's my mouse? As I said, it's going to be a short demo. Well, I mean, there's more, but like, you know, there's time limits, and I'm trying to be respectful of them. So what is parametric design? Because that's basically what we're doing. And I think that it really goes back to that moment where I switched from paper to computer. Because if you look at these instructions, and they're talking about 1/4 of the circumference of the chest, when you're on paper, you're going to measure 1/4 of whatever it is, and you're going to draw that line. But when you make the step to computer, I think a lot of people in this room will just sort of intuitively say, well, we're going to put that in a variable, right? The chest, and then we'll just take 1/4 of that. Like, that seems kind of obvious. Well, that's parametric design, really, because now you can just change that variable and your design will adapt. So a traditional sewing pattern, if we sort of make the code translation, would be something statically defined. We have a pattern, and then it's some sort of digital representation of what a sewing pattern is. With parametric design, our pattern can take some input and then adapt itself, and then return a digital representation of a sewing pattern that takes that input into account. You know, a function, basically. So that is sort of like the high-level idea behind parametric design. So how do we implement that in free sewing? What do parametric sewing patterns look like? Well, they look like this. But, you know, this is not a masterclass. So today we're going to focus on this part, right? So on the left you have your input. Then you have your pattern, which is one function. But then under the hood, we actually have different parts. Different parts are like the front, the back, the sleeve, the cuff, the collar, that sort of stuff. They sort of like exist on their own. And all of those are going to be a function. They're going to have points, they're going to have paths, which are lines. We're going to get into that in a second. And then we can render that to SVG, or we can also render to React, right? Today, to get to a simple pattern, well, to get to a parametric sewing pattern, this is all we need, right? And if you're thinking, then what's all that other stuff? Why do you have to make it so complicated? Well, all that other stuff is for more advanced use cases, right? So vertically, you have stacks, and stacks allow you, normally, if you have different parts, they are laid out next to each other. Stacks allow you to stack them on top of each other, as you can see on the left. And then vertically, these boxes are different sets. So rather than give our pattern one set of like measurements and all that, we're going to give it multiples. And we use that to do things like show the effect of a particular option, particular parameter on the design. So you can see here, the designer can set a minimum and a maximum value of that option that makes sense. And we can visualize that by using this extra feature. Another thing that we do there is we run automated tests in our repository to test patterns, sort of like quality assurance, make sure that they don't go off the rails We test this for a range of sizes, measurements that we have, but we also test this for doll clothes and like giants, right? Because a good parametric design should adapt to the extremes of that sort of size range. If that looks familiar to you because you're used to sewing, it looks a bit like a commercial sewing pattern, but there's an important difference here that I have to explain, which is drafting versus grading. So drafting, a draft of a sewing pattern, we call it drafting when you make the sewing pattern. Grading is how things are done traditionally in commercial sewing patterns. So I have an example here. This is a commercial sewing pattern, and this basically comes in sizes, but only one of these sizes is typically drafted from scratch, you know, with like quarter of measurement, quarter of chest, stuff like that, that I explained earlier. The rest of those sizes are sort of like extrapolated. Add a little bit there, add a little bit there, add a little bit there. Okay, that's the next size. And then once again, and then maybe also down. That's how it's made. This is called grading, right? On the left, we have a free sewing pattern. You put in the measurements, and it comes out for you, right? So no grading. Now, why does this matter? Well, because parametric design is better in every way, except in the ways that it is not, right? By which I mean, on the right side, with a graded pattern, you might not get good fit, but you will also always have something that resembles a normal sized garment, maybe not your size. On the left side, with parametric design, you're really vulnerable to the garbage in, garbage out problem, right? If people put in like bonkers measurements, like that one, well, the result is going to be like real bad, like unwearable, unmakeable. And that's a problem that we have, because when you think about this, at one point do you tell the user, hey, these measurements, that can't be right, because maybe it is right. You don't know their body. And, you know, it's really sort of like potentially hurtful to tell people that I think you should double check your measurements because something seems off, right? We shouldn't be making assumptions about people's bodies. Like this is a bit of a minefield. So we tend to not say too much, and you know, sometimes that yields to bad results because the input is bad. I think it's fair to put that out there as like that's a problem. Okay, let's look at how this actually works. We're going to look at some code now, right? So on the left we have our instructions that we're going to use as a guide, and then on the right we're going to see how do we turn that into code, right? So we have our function, but we already learned actually it's not like that. We have a function, wait, what am I saying here? So we have a function that gets the parameters, and we're going to return our pattern, or a digital representation. But, as I was saying, we know that every part, front, sleeve, back, all of that stuff, is going to be its own thing. So we have an example here. Our front part is a function. I switched to fat arrow notation here. And it gets a bunch of parameters, right? And the FreeSewing core library is going to give you a lot of parameters that you can work with. One of them is the part object, right? Which is actually the thing that we're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to mutate this object, and then we're going to return it, right? So if you look at our instructions on the left, we need to draw a vertical line and mark the top as point A, okay? We need to create a point. How do we do that? Well, we can destructure points, which is an object that holds all the points of the part, and we can destructure the point constructor. And then we just do points.a is new point 0, 0. Because a point takes the x and the y coordinates, because we're just mapping a point in a 2D plane. This is not rocket science, right? It's kind of straightforward. Okay. Now we need to do from point A square out to the right, measuring 1/4 of the circumference of the chest. Okay, the circumference of the chest. How do we get that in FreeSewing? Well, you get an object that is called measurements, that you can also destructure, and it holds all the measurements that the user supplied in millimeters. Okay, cool. So we can do measurement chest over 4. All right. So far, so good. We got this. Now we need to add 2 inches. Okay. That's a bit of a problem when we think about the fact that we need to support doll clothes and grown-ups. How do we translate these 2 inches into, you know, something that makes sense? And what even are these 2 inches? Well, it says there that this is ease, but like, what is ease, right? I think we probably need to do a little side adventure here and explain what ease is. Don't worry, just one slide. So ease is what is extra fabric in the garment that allows you to move. So that lady on the left would not be able to move her arm if there was no ease in the garment. You would get stuck, right? So this is sort of like functional ease. It's added to the garment so that you can move, right? Then we also have design ease. It's in the middle. The t-shirt that lady is wearing is way too big. I mean, if you don't see that, that's fine. But trust me, it's way too big. You see the shoulder seam is halfway around down her arm. But that's just a style choice. So when we say it's too big, it's not too big. It's absolutely fine. But like, you know, if you look at a sewing pattern, it's like the wrong size for her, but it's a style choice. So that's design ease. And then finally, we also have negative ease. Negative ease is when a garment is actually too small. But, and you can also, you know, you need stretch to use negative ease, and this is typically used so that the garment is like tight. Sportswear, swimwear, skinny jeans, they all have negative ease. All right, back to it. So we know, okay, so this is ease, so how do we do that? So in free sewing, we're going to define a so-called design option here. Because if we're adding all this stuff, why not let the user control this? Why should we decide how much ease there is, right? So typically, we're going to destructure our options object, and then there's going to be an option, and we're going to call it chest ease now. And then we do 1 plus, because it's a percentage, and divide by 4, and Bob's your uncle. Okay, adding points, we got that. But we need to connect the dots at some point. So those we call paths in free sewing. And I'll give you an example. So once again, just like we did with points and points, the constructor, we have paths, which holds all the paths, and the path constructor. Paths.example is new path. We instantiate a path with no parameters. And then we have all of these methods, move, line, curve, right? And if you've ever worked with PostScript, SVG, Canvas, or basically most graphics APIs, they all use this sort of way of drawing, right? It's sort of this pen plotter way of doing. So move somewhere without drawing a line draws a line, and then curve uses cubic Bezier curves. And once again, I don't have the time to explain what that is, but I assume a lot of you know, and if not, it's quite intuitive. Check Wikipedia. Okay. So adding points and lines is, you know, what's the value of free sewing? We also have a lot of sort of helper methods in our API to make it easy to do things that you typically do in a sewing pattern, right? You can 100% use this to do other 2D line drawing stuff, but like it's really for sewing patterns, you know? An example here is shift fraction to words. You can call that on a point to say like, okay, I need a point between these 2 points. You know, that sort of stuff. The paths also has a bunch of methods. Let me put them on the slide here quickly. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into them, but freesewing.dev/reference/API has all of the free sewing API documentation with examples and code and stuff like that. So, you know, you can look into it if you're interested. Okay, I'm going to give you a complete example now of how you can create a new design, as we call that, right? So the first thing you do is you import the design, what we call a super constructor from free sewing core library. Then we have some internationalization data, we have some metadata about, and then we have our actual parts that we constructed earlier, right? And then to create a design, I've called it FOSDEM, you do a new design, because design is a super constructor, so it will return a constructor. And then you give it some metadata and basically the list of parts, right? So we now have FOSDEM, which is a constructor, and if you instantiate it, you get a pattern. So we have design, and an instance of a design is a pattern. And then we export that stuff, and we use named export so people can, you know, import the metadata without having to instantiate the pattern and so on. So let's look at all those different imports that we have there. This is the internationalization data, aka translation. So our core library supports translation, and at a certain moment we offered free sewing in, like the website, in 6 different languages. But we had to stop that because the maintenance was just killing us. So now it's just English. Sorry about that. But we still support translation. We just only provide English. And these days with AI, I think most people can get around that. So this is just a little bit of a structure with like the title and the design and the part names and the strings that you might be using, and then the options. And you see that I used hello FOSDEM there. So we have this thing where if you're going to put text in the pattern, you need to make sure that you're using actually a translation key rather than the real text. That way it can get translated. Then we have some metadata. This is where we blur the line between what the core library does and then what we do in our mono repo to tie all of these patterns together and give some information in the front end. The core library doesn't care at all about this. This is just to help front-end integration, stuff like that. And then here we're finally at the good stuff. This is our part, you know. The only difference is that where previously we said it's a function, now our function is on the draft property and we have some extra data, a name. We tell it which measurements are required and our options and stuff like that. And the reason that this is important is that every part in FreeSewing stands on its own. So you can freely combine parts from different designs to make your own Frankenstein design. That's 100% supported. Okay, I'm going to just briefly mention, so now we have a new design and it can go in our collection. I'm going to briefly skip through how you get from that design to a pattern, should you be interested. So you can just import your pattern there. We also import a plugin to style the SVG. And you do pattern is a new FOSDEM design. You give it all of the options that you want. You use the plugin and you call draft. And then when you call render on that, you get the SVG. That's all there is to it. If you want to get started with FreeSewing, you can start on your own with npx@freesewing/studio, which spins up our development environment. Or you can check out either our mono repo on Codeberg or a fork of it, and then you can run npm kickstart. For the people who have a sewing background, we often team up with people who have more of a coding background and people with more of a sewing background to make one design. So, you know, in the Venn diagram, there's not that many people in the middle, so teaming up is a good way to go. So if you're watching the stream or here and more from the sewing background, you can totally reach out to us and we'll hook you up with somebody who's good at code. So you can run FreeSewing in Node.js or another JavaScript runtime like Bun or Deno on the back end in a serverless function, or of course in the browser like we do on freesewing.eu. I'm looking at the clock. So there's the stuff that we do for, and the previous speaker talked about this, there's this difference between your target audience being developers or your target audience being users. So on the left side, you know, we publish NVM packages, semantic versioning, we keep a changelog, API docs, developer experience, all of that stuff. But then on the right is like we have to create an entire UI, we have to support export to PDF, we have to let people tile in page sizes for their printer, you know, we need to provide sewing instructions, website docs, they need to be able to manage their account, like a whole bunch of stuff. And of course, the scope of the project gets quite a bit wider when you actually start building stuff for end users. So, you know, this is sort of like a big thing. I want to quickly talk about the infrastructure we have in case there's people who are more from that background. So we are hosted on statichost.eu today, which uses the Bunny CDN. The FreeSewing website is a completely static pile of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we basically ship all the code to the user and let them run it, sort of like a bring your own compute thing, which means that we don't have to pay for that, and that's good. The flip side of that is that we have to ship all of that code. So I think we passed 8 terabytes of bandwidth per month last year. So, you know, it's a lot. But thankfully, Static Host has made a good deal for us. And then we have a backend, which is a REST API Express. We use SQLite because we like it simple. And then we also host our own forum instance. Okay. So, lessons that I've learned as a maintainer. This has been a long journey. I learned a lot along the way. It wasn't always easy. So here are 3 tips for people who might end up in a similar situation. The first is to touch grass, as they say. This is me and my wife on a cycling trip. I like to cycle, and it's good to go out there and do something different. My day job is computers. FreeSewing is also computers, and like you sometimes just need to do something else. So, you know, while on one hand I want to encourage you to get into this stuff, on the other hand I'm also like, you know, step away from time to time. The second thing is that people come and go. This is my cat who passed away sadly last year, and I was really heartbroken by it, but then it's better to have had her than to have not had her. And I think it's the same with, you know, contributors or people who support the project financially. Like, they go, and, you know, they might have other interests in their life and stuff like that, and like, it always hurts. It always does. But then you have to be, you know, mindful of the fact that, there's all those people out there who didn't contribute, and you really need to be appreciative. And I am very appreciative of all the contributors of FreeSewing, all the people who support it. I think that's really good. And then the final piece of advice is that you should prepare for retirement. What I mean by that is that at the beginning you're going to be working on your own, right? And then at a certain moment you're going to have other people helping out, and that is fantastic. But I think that you should always try to think about, okay, but like what can I give away so that other people can take care of it, right? Because I think that the ultimate goal should be that the project outlives you and is bigger than what you can do. I think it's also a good ego check to be conscious of the fact, like, it would be good if I can give this to other people so that they can carry it even further than I have been carrying it on my own. All right, last bit of old man advice. And then the final thing that I want to get into is the sort of interdisciplinary FOSS, difficult words. I learned a lot through this journey. When I started out, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was so far out of my comfort zone. But like, when I look back now, I'm very happy of all the lessons that I learned, and I feel much more confident in the code I write and the stuff that I do, and it's been really great. But at the same time, the more I know, the more I am conscious of my own limitations and the fact that, well, yeah, I guess I'm a developer now, but like I'm sure that there's countless of people in this room who will, are much better at this stuff than I am. And then on the flip side of that, in the sewing thing, it's like, yeah, I'm pretty good at making clothes, I can do that. But like, I also know a lot of people who are much better at that than I am, right? Yet somehow, in combining these two things, we sort of ended up with something that seems to be valuable to a lot of people. So if you're like me, first time at FOSDEM, or if you're just like a little bit like, I just don't think that I have what it takes to write a new front-end framework or whatever, like, you don't have to. You can look around to the other interests in your life and try to find out, are there ways there that I can sort of combine these things, combine different skills, and then come up with something that is, I don't know, maybe great. Do you have any questions?
Amazing talk. I'm using Seamly. I'm using Seamly.
Oh, okay.
I'm wondering if you have a way to import, to translate patterns that I created in Seamly to FreeSewing, and then kind of moving on.
Yeah.
Seamly is nice with this kind of...
Yeah, so for people who don't know, just a bit of context, Seamly is Seamly Valentina, they're forks of the same code base, is also a software to create sewing patterns, but it's like a point-and-click graphical thing, right? Whereas FreeSewing is patterns as code. So to answer your questions, can those patterns be translated? In principle, yes, because they're defined in XML. But then the question is, what's the parametric angle? Because Seamly does not really enforce that the way that we do. So you can get a pattern, but will that pattern then work? And when we put something on our website, we have a certain bar of like, okay, it has to work for all of these cases. So technically it is possible, but the devil's really in the details.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. Right. You said something about if you're good at sewing, we can find a developer for you that's going to help with that stuff. If you're good at developing, can you find somebody in sewing that can help us to make patterns for FreeSewing?
Yeah, so I'm speaking from experience here, and we get often the question of people who are good at sewing, like, I can't do this code stuff. This is why I'm rolling that out as an example. I don't often get the other question, so thank you. Yeah, the other way works around too. If you're like, I want to help, but I don't really know about this pattern stuff, we can 100% hook you up with some people who are in the other camp. The slides are also uploaded on the FOSDEM thingy, so you can also go to codeberg.org/freesewing/FOSDEM 2026 to find all the source material for the slides. So. And I'll also be outside after this talk. I also have goodies, so if you want that, you can come get them.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have one more question. You've mentioned the intersection of the Venn diagram between code and sewing. I think I might be somewhere in there. My mother owns both a haberdashery come a textile shop, and she also has a huge pile of those Barda magazines that you showed, right, with tons of really cool patterns, but they are all on paper. I'm not aware of them being digitized. Have you ever considered taking such commercial patterns and digitizing them so that other people can share them? Of course, I'm sidestepping the intellectual property rights question here, but I'm more interested in the technical challenge, and parameterizing that would be another can of worms, I bet.
Yeah. So, okay, so there's a few things here. First, going from paper to digital, you can just scan a pattern, right? So let's assume we have a PDF. Man down. The problem is that you have basically a binary, you know, and you have to figure out, well, what were they thinking when they made this pattern? Why is this line like this and stuff like that? So it's not that obvious. You need people who are very good at pattern design to sort of figure that out. And knowing those people, they will probably be like, show me the finished garment and I'll just make it from scratch. So I think it's very difficult to do this in an automated way. I also want to mention, like you said, sidestepping the intellectual property issues, but I actually think it's worth talking about because it's 100% okay to take a garment and reverse engineer that into a pattern. That's how the garment industry works. That's tradition. There's no problem there, right? But when we're talking about a pattern, you know, you're sort of like people who sell patterns for a living. If you then copy that pattern, you're like taking bread out of their pocket, you know. So I'm like, I'm not cool with that. But of course, if you make a book with drafting instructions that's teaching people how to create a pattern, then okay, that's cool. You can take what you learn and implement that in code. That's cool for me. Like I'm not saying that, you know, everybody does what they will, but when it's about can I contribute a pattern to free sewing, then I'm like, not if you're making it harder for somebody who makes a living selling the comparable thing, then we do not do that.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have a question because I'm like you, I bought a sewing machine to do repairs. And do you have any tips for that? Because I'm finding it very hard to repair stuff. It looks horrible.
Here's my number one tip for sewing machines. The very best sewing machine is the one you have access to, right? Because after that, I think the general sort of understanding is that you try to buy something that is more sturdy, mechanical, and less plastic and computer, right? And if you have the room for it, consider looking into an industrial machine because they're big and loud, but they're fantastic. The problem with industrial is that they typically do one thing and do it incredibly well, whereas if you're just starting out, you want a machine that can do many different things. So, you know, you start with a regular machine, and then later you have the slippery slope of collecting industrial machines. I speak from experience.
Hello. So this is really cool, by the way. For those of us who have a lot more experience with computers, kind of follows on from this previous question. Where should we start if we've never made a garment before, but we want to get into it? Obviously, start with free sewing, but like any tips for like getting going? And in addition to that, how much time investment should we expect before we've got something we could wear?
Okay, so when you say where do we start, you mean where do we start with sewing, right? Okay, so my advice there actually differs from what you will find if you take a sewing class, where they will start with something simple. I'm like, pick the thing that would really, you'd be so happy if you could make that, and then just go for it. And try to find, I mean, you know, within reason, maybe, but like trousers are arguably not easy. Like it would be much easier to start with a t-shirt, or even a shirt is easier than trousers. I started with trousers because I was like, that's going to be cool. And I got this sort of like high from it, even though they were not great, that really carried me through those initial moments of where it's going to be difficult. So I would say pick the achievements that you want to be like, oh man, if I could do that, I would feel so great about it, and then just go for it. And if you go online, you will find out the sewing community is like a super welcoming and helpful bunch. Really awesome people. There's plenty of people out there who will help you. You can also come to FreeSewing. There's a lot. We have a Discord where people will answer all your questions and help you.
I think we'll have time for two more
ahead.
questions.
A really interesting thing. As someone who's actually in the intersection of doing both, it's really cool to see how you're kind of actually pulling it together because there's so much potential there. You mentioned that you really have set up so you can really combine the different things and everything. How do you, for example, with adjusting arms, how do you, for example, make sure that you're actually making pieces that fit together? Like you're changing the scope of the neckline, for example.
I think if I understand the question correctly, you're like, how do you make sure the arm fits the body? All right. So if we go, maybe I should just quickly cycle back. So we have this sort of like store, right? And this store allows us to share data between, so here at the top, that green box. So how that happens is we draft, for example, the front, and we store the length of the arm side seam in the store, and then we draft the back, and we store the length there. And then when we have this, we draft the sleeve, we know exactly how long the sleeve gap seam needs to be because it's in the store, and then we iterate until it's perfect, right? But this also means that we need to control the order in which parts are drafted, and this is also like, I didn't go into all of it here, but like we take care of all of that. So that's how we do it. And there's no magical way because we use cubic Bezier curves and there's no closed form solution to calculate the arc of a Bezier curve. So we try and then we see how far we're off and then we tweak some parameters and we do that a couple of times until it's within 1 millimeter, right? And so when I move that slider on the website, all of that is happening, but it's just fast.
So another passion of mine is cooking. When you scale cooking from 8 to 100, spices don't work. You cannot scale linearly. You have to scale them in a different way. And I see the same problem with grading. And do you have kind of some insight to make it work algorithmically? Because often I get a picture of somebody that's say, okay, size S, but actually is not. Or, well, not everywhere. So.
Yeah, so we don't really have the problem with grading because we just take the measurements as input. But people who use grading, what you will see is that brands that have a large size range will typically draft 2 individual patterns, one on the largest end of the spectrum and one on the smaller, so that the grading doesn't need to deviate too far from the base, because it's a bit like a game of telephone, you know? The further you get away, the further it gets like, you know. So then if the size range is big, like some brands, the pattern I threw up is from Cashmerette, which is a well-respected sewing pattern brand for curvy ladies, or should we just say normal ladies. And they have a wide size range, and I know for a fact that they actually draft 2 individual blocks and then grade between them to avoid this sort of like things starting to fall apart a bit when you go further and further into the grading. Did that answer your question? You can say no. Then I just misunderstood. Magic formula, right. I haven't found it yet. I'll let you know.
So thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you.